Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is August 4, 2024, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's a privilege to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago philosophy meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. This is the 14th and final meeting of our series on Plato's final work, The Laws, and it's also the end of Season 4 of Plato's Pod. We look forward to returning in about 2 months with Season 5, when we'll continue to build on all of the insights we've uncovered in 63 episodes since the podcast began in 2021, and we'll aim for an even more comprehensive understanding of the first principles underpinning all of Plato's works. So today, I'll again be joining the participants in discussion, while Michael Fitzpatrick leads us through the conclusion of the laws with the second part of Book 12, which we began reading 2 weeks ago. We'll leave time in today's meeting for some reflections on the laws and its central themes, and I'm particularly interested to see what we think about the potential for success of Crete's new colony, Magnesia, with the laws that the Athenian, Clinias, and Megillus have discussed throughout the dialogue. So with thanks to Michael for organizing this meeting and preparing the notes that are posted in the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. Before I turn the microphone over to him, I just wanted to remind everyone that, as always, to contribute your thoughts to the discussion, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. And for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. So that everyone has a chance to speak, Michael will call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. Once we finish recording in 2 hours, we invite anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and thanks everyone for being here. I've placed the handout on your screen. Today, we're completing our discussion of the laws, focusing initially on the final few pages of Book 12 from 960D onward, in which the Nocturnal Council of the Authorities is fully introduced after being teased a few times earlier in the dialogue. We'll read the whole of the passage, skipping briefly over the section on the soul, which we'll come back to in the second part of our discussion. It is my view that in this section, Plato fully completes the coincidence between philosophy and power. Discerning readers may remember that, as the condition laid out in the Republic, that peace will never come to a society until philosophers rule. As we noted last time, the place of philosophers is spread across 2 institutions, potentially 3, depending on whether or not we want to include the ambassadors among them, those institutions being the guardians of the laws and the scrutineers. But a third meeting is created here that brings together the most philosophical natures from those offices, as well as the Minister of Education and any promising youth, to gather together to discuss philosophy at leisure for the purpose of ensuring that the daily work of governing a just society actually is always trending towards justice. It's a space for them to contemplate the forms and to ensure that society does not stray from them. As I note on our title page, saying that a philosopher must rule for a society to become truly good is not to create a caste system in which philosophers sit at the pinnacle of a hierarchy and dominate everyone else. Quite the opposite. If there is a hierarchy at all in the Republic, it is that of the working class at the top, served by the military who have less rights and privileges, and both of them served by the philosophers who have the least rights and privileges of all. So it is misleading to even call them philosopher kings, which for us moderns has a lot of negative connotations. Instead, I propose we think of them as philosopher civil servants, for the true intention here is a life of service through conscription, not one of domination through free choice. I think this mentality clearly comes through in the laws as well, and I invite us today to think of all the ways Plato's monumental collection of dialogues informs this final section as we think about what it would really mean for those who love wisdom more than power to be compelled to lead a society. So we're going to give a dramatic reading in which I will be the Athenian and James will be Clinias. This reading is going to cover 960D almost to the very end of the chapter, skipping one section. As such, this is a much longer reading than our normal standard readings, but we wanted to get all of the text out in front of us before we begin our discussion. So I very much invite listeners here with us today to take notes as we go through the reading of any questions or themes that you want to come back to once we complete the reading. So this is a dramatic reading of the Nocturnal Council, also known as the Daily Meeting of Philosophers at Leisure. I begin with the Athenian. That is precisely the situation we want to see in our state and its citizens. Not merely physical health and soundness, but the rule of law in their souls, and, more important than all that, the preservation of the laws themselves. In fact, it seems to me that the service we've still not done for the laws is to discover how to build into them a resistance to being reversed.
Well, that's serious because I don't suppose there's a way of giving anything that sort of property.
But there is. I see that quite clearly now.
Well, then, we mustn't abandon our task till we've achieved this for the legal code we've expounded. It would be silly to waste our labor on something by failing to construct it on a firm foundation.
You're right to encourage me, and you'll find me as keen as you are.
Well, splendid. So, what is a safety device for our political system and legal code going to be, according to you? And how can we construct it?
We said that we ought to have in the state a council with the following range of membership. The 10 guardians of the laws who are currently the eldest were to convene together with all persons who had won awards of distinction, and the travelers who had gone abroad to see if they could discover any special method of keeping a legal code intact. When these observers got back safe and sound, they were to be accepted as suitable associates of the council, provided they had first passed the scrutiny of its members. In addition, each member had to bring a young man of at least 30 years of age, but only after selecting him as particularly well qualified by natural abilities and education. On these terms, the young man was to be introduced to the other members of the council, and if they approved of him, he was to join them. If not, they were not to breathe a word to anyone about the fact that he was considered, least of all to the rejected candidate himself. The council was to meet before dawn, when people are least beset by other business, public or private. That was more or less the description we gave earlier, wasn't it?
Well, certainly it was.
So I'm going to resume the subject of this council, and here's the point I want to make about it. I maintain that if one were to lower it as a sort of anchor for the whole state, then provided conditions were suitable, it would keep safe everything we wanted it to.
How so?
Now, at this crucial moment, we must strain every muscle to get things right.
Well, that's a fine sentiment. Now do what you have in mind.
The question we have to ask about anything, Clinias, is this. What is it that has the special power of keeping it safe in each of its activities? In a living creature, for instance, this is the natural function of the soul and the head in particular.
Well, again, what's your point?
Well, when these two are functioning satisfactorily, they ensure the animal's safety, don't they?
How so?
Because no matter what else is true of either, the soul is the seat of reason, and the head enjoys the faculties of sight and hearing. In short, the combination of reason with the highest senses constitute a single faculty that would have every right to be called the salvation of the animal concerned.
Well, that's likely enough, I suppose.
Of course it is, but how do reason and the senses combine to ensure the safety of a ship in fair weather or foul? Isn't it because the captain and crew interpret sense data by reason, as embodied in the expertise captains have, that they keep themselves and the whole ship safe?
Well, naturally.
We've no need to multiply examples, but to take a general in command of his army, or any doctor tending a human body, what will they each aim at, on the assumption that they intend, as they should, to preserve their charges safe and sound? Won't the general aim at victory and control over the enemy? And won't doctors aim to keep the body in a healthy condition?
Of course.
Now consider a doctor who can't recognize the state of the body we've just called health, or a general who doesn't know what's meant by victory and the other terms we reviewed. Could either of them possibly be judged to have a rational knowledge of his field?
Well, of course not.
And if the ruler of a state were obviously ignorant of the target at which a statesman should aim, would he really deserve his title ruler? Would he be capable of ensuring the safety of an institution whose purpose he entirely failed to appreciate?
Certainly not.
Well, then, in the present circumstances, if our settlement of this territory is to be finished off properly, it looks as if we shall have to provide it with some constituent that understands A, this target we have mentioned, the target, whatever we find it is, of the statesman, B, how to hit that target, and C, which laws above all and which persons have helpful advice to give and which not. If a state lacks some such constituent, no one will be surprised to see it staggering from one irrational and senseless expedient to another in its affairs.
That's true.
So, is there any institution or constituent part of our state qualified and prepared to function as an organ of protection? Can we name one?
No, sir, no, not with much assurance anyway. But I guess if I must, I think your remarks point to the council you said just now had to convene during the night.
You've caught my meaning splendidly, Clinias. As the drift of our present argument shows, that body must possess virtue in all its completeness, which means above all that it will not take erratic aim at one target after another, but keep its eye on one single target and shoot all its arrows at that.
Certainly.
Now we can see why it is hardly surprising that rules and regulations fluctuate so much from state to state. It is because legislation has a different aim in each. Nor is it surprising that in most cases you find that some people think of justice as nothing but the subjection of the state to the rule of this or that type of person without regard to their vice or virtue, while others think of it as the opportunity to become rich, no matter whether they are thereby enslaved or not. Others again are bent hell for leather on a life of freedom. Some legislators keep both ends in view, and their laws have the dual purpose of securing control over other states and freedom for their own. The cleverest legislators of all, as they like to think of themselves, so far from aiming at one single end, look not only to these but all others like them, simply because they cannot identify any supremely valuable end to which all others ought, in their view, to contribute.
Well then, sir, the line we took so long ago was the right one. We said that every detail of our legislation ought to have a single end in view, and the proper name to call it was, I think we agreed, virtue.
Yes,
And I think we maintained that the virtues were four.
indeed we did.
The leading one, to which not only the other three but everything else should be orientated, was reason.
You take the point admirably, Clinias. Now follow the rest of the argument. As far as the captain, doctor, and general are concerned, we have already indicated that their intellect aims at some appropriate single end. Now it is the turn of the statesman's reason to be investigated. Let's personify it and ask it the following question. My good sir, what aim do you have in view? What's your single overriding purpose? The intelligent doctor can identify his accurately enough. So can't you, with all your superior wisdom, as I'd suppose you'd claim, identify yours? Or can you too, Clinias and McGillis, answer for him and tell me precisely what your notion of his aim is, just as I've often given you detailed accounts of the notions of many other people on their behalf?
No, sir, we certainly cannot.
What about replying, I think he should make every effort to get an overall understanding of his aim as well as see it in its various contexts.
What context, for example?
Well, when we said there were four species of virtue, obviously the very fact that there were four meant that each had to be thought of as somehow distinct from the others.
Well, surely.
Yet, in fact, we call them all by a single name. We say courage is virtue, wisdom is virtue, and the other two similarly, on the ground that really they are not several things, but just one virtue.
Very true.
It's not hard to explain how these two virtues and the rest differ from each other and how each has acquired a different name. The real problem is this. Why precisely have we described both of them as well as the others by this common term virtue?
What do you mean?
My point is perfectly easy to explain. Shall we let one of us ask the questions and the other answer them?
Again, what do you mean?
Here's the question for you to put to me. Why is it after calling both by the single term virtue, in the next breath we speak of two virtues, courage and wisdom? I'll tell you why. One of them, courage, copes with fear and is found in wild animals as well as human beings, notably in the characters of very young children. The soul, you see, becomes courageous by a purely natural process, without the aid of reason. By contrast, in this absence of reason, a wise and sensible soul is out of the question. That is true now, has always been true, and always will be true. The two processes are fundamentally different.
Well, that's true.
So there's your explanation of why there are two different virtues. Now it's your turn. You tell me why they are one and the same thing. Your job, you understand, is to tell me why the four of them nevertheless form a unity. And when you have demonstrated that unity, ask me to show you again in what sense they are four. Next, after that, we ought to ask ourselves what constitutes adequate knowledge of any object that has a name and a definition. Is it enough to know only the name and not the definition? On the contrary, if a man is worth his salt, wouldn't it be a disgrace in him not to understand all these points about a topic so grand and important?
Well, presumably it would.
And as for the giver or guardian of laws, and indeed anyone who thinks of his own virtue as superior to the rest of the world's and has won awards for his achievement, is there anything more important than the qualities we are now discussing? Courage, restraint, justice, and wisdom.
Of course not.
So, in such circumstances, what role should the expounders, teachers, and lawgivers, the guardians of the rest of the community, play when a criminal needs enlightenment and instruction, or perhaps correction and punishment? Should they not prove better than anyone else at giving him a full explanation and description of the effects of virtue and vice? Or is some poet visitor to the state or some self-styled educationalist going to put up a better show than the winner of the palm for every kind of virtue? Where there are no efficient and articulate guardians with an adequate understanding of virtue, it will be hardly surprising if the state, precisely because it is unguarded, meets the fate of so many states nowadays.
No, hardly surprising at all, I suppose.
Well then, shall we carry out these proposals or what? Shall we make sure our guardians are more highly qualified than the man in the street to explain what virtue is and to put it into practice? How else could our state function like a head and sense of a wise man, now that it possesses within itself something analogous to protect it?
Where is this resemblance, sir? How do we draw such a comparison?
Obviously, the state itself corresponds to the trunk. And the junior guardians, chosen for their natural gifts and the acuteness of their mental vision, live as it were at the summit and survey the whole state. They store up in their memory all the sensations they receive while on guard, and act as reporters for their elder colleagues of everything that takes place in the state. And the old men, we could compare them to the intellect for their high wisdom in so many vital questions, take advantage of this assistance and advice of their juniors in debating policy, so that the joint efforts of both ranks effectively ensure the safety of the entire state. Now, is this the sort of organization we want to see, or some other? Should the state, in fact, keep all of its citizens on the same level without giving some a more specialized training and education than others?
My dear sir, that's quite impracticable.
Then we have to pass on to a more advanced education than the one we described earlier.
Perhaps so.
What about the education we touched on a moment ago? Would that answer our needs?
Certainly it would.
Didn't we say that a really skilled craftsman or guardian in any field must be able not merely to see the many individual instances of a thing, but also to win through to a knowledge of the single central concept? And when he's understood that, to put the various details in their proper place in the overall picture?
We did, and rightly.
So, what better tool can there be for a penetrating investigation of a concept than an ability to look beyond the many dissimilar instances to the single notion?
Probably none.
Probably. No, my dear fellow. This is most certainly the surest method we can follow, no matter who we are.
I trust you, sir, and I agree. So let's carry on with the discussion on that basis.
So it looks as if we have to compel the guardians of our divine foundation to get an exact idea of the common element in all the four virtues, that factor which, though single, is to be found in courage, restraint, justice, and wisdom, and thus, in our view, deserves the general title virtue. This element, my friends, if only we have the will, is what we must grip until we can explain adequately the essence of what we have to contemplate, whether it is a single entity, a composite whole, or both, or whatever. If this point eludes us, can we ever expect to attain virtue when we can't say whether it comprises a great number of things or just four, or whether it is a unity? Never. Not if we believe our own advice, anyway, and we'll have to ensure the growth of virtue in the state by some other means. But if in the circumstances we decide we ought to abandon the attempt entirely, abandon it we must.
No, sir. In the name of the gods of hospitality, we must never abandon such a project. You seem to us to be absolutely right. So now then, how is one to tackle the problem?
Let us postpone the question of method. The first thing we have to settle and decide amongst ourselves is whether the attempt should be made at all.
Indeed, it should, if possible.
Well then, do we take the same line about goodness and beauty? Should the guardians know no more than that both these terms are plurality, or should they understand the senses in which they are unities?
It looks as if they are more or less obliged to comprehend that too, how they are unities.
Well, what if they understood the point, but couldn't find the words to demonstrate it?
How absurd! That's the condition of a slave.
Well, then, isn't our doctrine going to be the same about all serious questions? If our guardians are going to be genuine guardians of the laws, they must have genuine knowledge of their real nature. They must be articulate enough to explain the real difference between good actions and bad, and capable of sticking to the distinction in practice.
Naturally.
And surely one of the finest fields of knowledge is theology, on which we've already lavished a great deal of attention. It's supremely important to appreciate, so far as it's given to man to know these things, the existence of the gods and the obvious extent of their power. The man in the street may be forgiven if he simply follows the voice of the law, but if any intended guardian fails to work hard to master every theological proof there is, we must certainly not grant him the same indulgence. In other words, we must never choose as a guardian of the laws anyone who is not preternaturally gifted or who has not worked hard at theology, or allow him to be awarded distinctions for virtue.
It's fair enough, as you say, that the idle or incompetent in this business should never be allowed to get anywhere near such honors.
So that concludes the first major section. We have one more small section, which comes at the end of the dialogue that we're now going to read, after which we're going to open up our first theme for discussion. So make sure to have your questions and observations ready. This last section is 968D to 969C. We begin again with the Athenian. First of all, of course, we shall have to compile a list of candidates qualified for the office of guardian by age, intellectual attainments, moral character, and way of life. Then there's the question of what they have to learn. It is difficult to find out this for oneself, and it is not easy either to discover somebody else who has already done so and learned from him. Quite apart from that, it will be a waste of time to produce written regulations about the order in which the various subjects should be tackled and how long should be spent on each, because even students, until they have thoroughly absorbed a subject, won't realize why it comes at just that point in the curriculum. So, although it would be a mistake to treat all these details as inviolable secrets, it would be fair to say that they ought not to be divulged beforehand, because advanced disclosure throws no light at all on the questions we're discussing.
Well then, sir, if that's the case, what are we to do?
My friends, we must chance our arm, as the saying is. If we are prepared to stake the whole Constitution on a throw of 3 6s or 3 1s, then that's what we'll have to do. And I'll shoulder part of the risk by giving a full explanation of my views on training and education, which we've now started to discuss all over again. However, the risk is enormous and unique. So I bid you, Clinias, take the business at hand, establish the state of the Magnesians, or whatever other name God adopts for it, and if you are successful, you'll win enormous fame. At any rate, you'll never lose a reputation for courage that will dwarf all your successors. And if, my good companions, if this wonderful council of ours can be formed, then the state must be entrusted to it, and practically no modern legislator will want to oppose us. We thought of our combined metaphor of the head and intellect, which we mentioned a moment ago, as idealistic dreaming. But it will all come true, provided the council members are rigorously selected, properly educated, and after the completion of their studies, lodged in the citadel of the country and made into guardians, whose powers of protection we have never seen excelled in our lives before. So that concludes our reading of the Nocturnal Council. And I want to open it up. Please raise your hands for questions and observations. And what I want to sort of start us off with, just as something for people to be contemplating, is the way in which the Nocturnal Council, which is, I want to stress again, it's not an extra institution that's being added. It's a unique space that is being opened up for select members of some of the other institutions to engage in philosophy without the pressures of daily office. And if you recall, in our meeting on, I think it was book 9, we saw that one of the features of this particular dialogue that was praised by Clinias and McGillis was the fact that they weren't having to rush through things. They weren't having to try to impress the masses or persuade anybody in the moment. They were able to just breathe and contemplate what would a set of just laws look like. And I very much think that the part of the purpose of the Nocturnal Council is to create this space to be at leisure so that the kind of philosophy that has been done here in the laws will continue throughout the life of the state. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at this. So with that, I'll open it up for discussion. Darren, start us off.
Hello everyone. Last meeting, so bit sad about this, but here we are. So there's a lot of stuff brought up in that passage. So I guess I'll just go over some of my points and see where I end up. So they start off this last section talking about the need to secure the state for perpetuity or perpetual security. And I noticed that Clinias does express some reservations about how this could be possible. I mean, for perpetuity forever. So I just raised this as a, something to think about how serious to take this. So I'll just leave that there. And then later on, they talk about there's an analogy with they talk about nocturnal council and they analogize it with the head of an animal or a person, with the faculties of sight and hearing. And then they say, or the Athenian says, in short, the combination of reason with the highest senses constitutes a single faculty that would have every right to be called the salvation of the animal concerned. So this language just really struck me because I just recall from other dialogues when they were sort of wrapping up, heading towards the end or the climax or what have you. They also use language of salvation. And remember, I remember discussing this at previous meetups too on those dialogues. So the one that, I can think of as Protagoras, they finally get to the point and they talk about salvation. And I think this also comes up in the Philebus or the Cratylus. I'm not sure, but it comes in other dialogues too. So I just thought I'll flag that language. I think that's interesting. The use of this discussion of salvation. Um, and then okay, just one last thing for now is I really like how they talk about the statesman's reason as if there's perhaps like a special type of reasoning or maybe we can talk about it in terms of degrees. Maybe they have a certain more of a certain type of reason. Regardless, I find that phrasing interesting, the statesman's reason. And then, of course, related to that, much of it is about what the statesman should aim at. So the target, the statesman. And I guess this reminded me of a lot of the previous discussion. So that's good, right? A lot of the previous parts of the laws. So I recall from book 3, this is one thing I remember discussing then because it really stood out to me, which is this idea that we shouldn't do anything except on the condition of a rational judgment or a rational outlook. So they talk about in book 3, so he says here that there's a desire common to all mankind, which is that events should obey whatever orders one feels like giving and whatever one wants. And then and Athenian says this, but you should only demand your own way in your prayers only if your wishes are supported by your rational judgment. In this, a rational outlook should be the object of the prayers and efforts of us all, states and individuals alike. So we shouldn't want anything and pursue anything except on the condition that it's grounded on reason. So it's not like whatever we want is what we should actually pursue. It's like whatever has gone through this process of reasons. It just reminded me of this discussion of the statesman's reason. And just one example of this, and then I'm done, which is like this comes back all the way back to, I think, book 1 and 2, which is on drinking parties too, because the claim there was that actually drinking parties and getting drunk even has a role in the state and and is part of the art of statesmanship. But there was a critique of how like people normally treat this issue. They're like they either like are for drinking or against drinking, and then and then there, there's discussion of how people go about debating this, but the statesman comes around to the view that there is a role for like wine and drinking and getting drunk insofar as you place it under, he calls it there the art of statesmanship, which is to see like what good it can do. And of course he goes to elaborate lengths to explain like the what good wine can and getting drunk can actually serve. So it's never that anything is good or bad on its own terms. So this is also related to an idea that we encountered previous in the laws, that there's nothing that's unconditionally good or bad except the good itself, right? So like anything could be good or bad, including wine. It's just like how we place it under or see how it can help us achieve the good or foster good characters. And it's not that like wine or getting drunk is bad on its own, but even that can be thought about through reason and so can be made to serve good ends. Okay, so I'm done. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really nice, Darren. I do think one of the unifying themes throughout Plato's dialogues is that what makes human life unique and special is that we've been given a faculty that is capable of discerning the forms. And so the elevation of reason is precisely on this grounds that reason has the ability to sort of see the form of each thing, which is going to determine the aim towards which a thing lives. And then reason can then figure out, okay, what's the best way to achieve that aim? So it's this unique teleological capacity of reason to discern between goals. Whereas, one might say that our desires are also oriented towards goals, but there's no discernment in our desires alone. It's just the combat of whichever desire we feel the strongest. That's the one that orients us. Whereas reason has that discerning capacity. And I think you're right to sort of see this section as coalescing a lot of those themes from the whole dialogue and orienting them into this particular little subset community that's being created to ensure that the life of reason continues to guide the state after its inception. The other thing I just wanted to add, since you brought up about the statesman having a target, is that this is, I think, a very clear allusion back to the dialogue of the statesman, where the entire dialogue is about this question of what is the target of a statesman. I tried in the handout to put as many footnotes as I could, pointing to different dialogues and stuff so that people could see the section as a summation of the Platonic canon. I didn't put more in here just because I didn't want this to become nothing but footnotes. But you should definitely be seeing these types of connections where questions that are raised here often get addressed fully in other Platonic dialogues. And I think that's very intentional. James?
Well, thanks, Michael and Darren. You both actually raised some, I think, really key points that I was going to talk about as well. We started this series on the laws with Book 10, which was about reason being in the very center of the universe and the soul being the very first cause of the universe. And we know from Plato's dialogues that reason is in the is a faculty of the soul itself. It's not a physical faculty like our five physical senses, but it's a faculty of the soul itself, which moderates need and desire. So here we have reason in the very center of the universe. We have reason in the soul moderating need and desire, and we have Darren. I like the way you recalled that mention at 687b of the common desire of all mankind is that events should obey our commands. And then actually back, and I can't remember which book that was in, but shortly before that, the Athenians said that virtue is the general concord of reason and emotion. And then shortly after, at 712a, he said, we should run our public and our private life, our homes and our cities, in obedience to what little spark of immortality lies in us, and dignify these edicts of reason with the name of law. So it is like they're looking for this universal thing, this reason, which is in the center of the universe, and they're looking for it. And I found this section that we read really it really makes the point about finding the unity. Particularly striking, I found, was that section where the Athenian says, obviously, the state itself corresponds to the trunk, and the junior guardians, chosen for their natural gifts and the acuteness of their mental vision, live as it were at the summit and survey the whole state. They store up in their memory all the sensations they receive while on guard and act as reporters for their elder colleagues of everything that takes place in the state. That really struck me as, they're observing, they're supposed to take these things into memory. And in the course of doing that and engaging in this discussion with the older guardians, that it's their chance to see how everything ties to this unity of reason, which underlies the universe, which forms the basis of the laws. The laws are of nature itself, and I think that's what really struck me from this section is this means of observing so that we can try to find the first principle, which I thought was really powerful. And also to find the order of the event. So if we're looking for the first principles, we have to see what came first, what came second, what came third, and to get that sequence correct so that we can correctly trace ourselves down to the first principles. So that I thought was particularly helpful. And then, I'll just wind up by saying that looking for the definition of virtue, I think, is key. And that goes back to the dialogue, the Meno, and the question, can virtue be taught? Is anybody endowed to say what the definition of virtue is? I mean, everybody has different concepts, and this section really gets into it, especially with when they differentiate courage as kind of a different form of virtue. So I thought that was really interesting, and it really says that no one, not even the guardians, are able to say what virtue itself is, but it does seem that it's some sort of derivative of reason. And so if they operate with reason, they will find their way to virtue, but nobody can define virtue. I think those who attempt to define virtue and impose their sense of virtue on everyone else are not going to be successful leaders. So they're setting up this leadership to be able to continue looking for virtue, seeking virtue, and maybe in that process being virtuous. So thank you.
Yeah, very nice, James. Lots of rich, interesting thoughts. I want to highlight the section that you talked about with I guess it's kind of a tree metaphor here, with the senior guardians and the junior guardians. One of the things that stuck out to me about that particular passage here is that really what's being described is a procedure of dialectic, much like Plato and the senior philosophers of the academy would have had with the junior students. So there's very much a sense in which this nocturnal council is going to have a dialectical structure to its nature, that you've got the wise philosophers who have achieved an ability to discern the form of the good, but they're interacting with these younger budding philosophers who are out in the society bringing in, daily insights of here's how these policies are being implemented in the day-to-day work, and then bringing that back so that the eternal truths can interact with the daily grind, and there can be that reflective equilibrium of constantly adjusting the laws and the policies of the state as the situation determines to accord with what they call here high wisdom. So I thought that was kind of a neat description that's given there. And the other thing I wanted to know, just for people who are trying to keep track of their Plato bingo card, is at the end of that paragraph where it says, should the state in fact keep all of its citizens on the same level without giving some a more specialized training and education than others? I think that is a blatantly obvious allusion to the idea in the Republic that you can't expect everybody to be a full-fledged philosopher. One, because philosophers are not always the most practical people for getting things done, but two, because that's an unreasonable expectation of the entire human herd, that all of us are going to have the types of dispositions and the height of virtue necessary to do that work. And so, again, we're seeing this expectation of, okay, that subset of society who has those gifts, they're going to be shoehorned into these roles where they have to serve everybody else who doesn't have those opportunities to make sure that they benefit from the wisdom of philosophy, even though they're not philosophers themselves. So this is not a statement about some kind of elitism. We got to make these people higher ranking than others. It's we've got to make sure wisdom extends to every part of society. And if that means, if it's not the case that every part of society can be made up of philosophers, then we need to have a part of society that is made up of philosophers who ensures that wisdom gets to every other part. And that's kind of the vision that's being put forth there. Darren, go ahead and jump back in here.
So I definitely want to respond to what you were just talking about, the nocturnal council, people nocturnal council having more advanced education. But I think just to stay on James's comment for now, I just want to respond to what he said first. So we see that part of the statesman's reason and what they have to know, it seems, is, as James says, the first principle. And here it's framed as trying to figure out, or it's being fleshed out as trying to figure out like what virtue is. Like amongst all the virtues, what is the thing that is in common to them that is virtue? And it's interesting that James brought up courage, because courage always seems to have this uneasy place. I feel like in the laws, the places where it's come up, and also in the Lakeys where they debate what is really courage. I just want to read this one line though in the reading today. So he says, "The soul, you see, becomes courageous by a purely natural process, without the aid of reason. By contrast, in this absence of reason, a wise and sensible soul is out of the question. That is true now, has always been true, and always will be true. The two processes are fundamentally different." So we want to understand, courage is possibly some kind of virtue, but it's also often problematized. Is it really a virtue, or how can it really be, or when is it really virtuous? So it has this problematic status. But ultimately, I think this whole discussion, though, for those of us who've read other Plato's dialogues, especially the early Socratic dialogues on all the various virtues, there's one on temperance, there's one on courage, there's one on like friendship, and so on and so forth. They're all like this, right? They're literally all exploring this question of how to define those virtues and what makes that a virtue. And ultimately, in every single one of those dialogues, the answer is, well, first of all, the answer is never explicitly presented to us, just like it's not here. But the suggestion is that it only becomes a virtue if it's related to the good somehow, if it's like heading towards a good, or has some kind of relation to the good itself. The point I want to make though is that I think it's interesting that although here it's saying that the statesman needs to understand this target or the good or what the good is. Once again, just like all those Socratic dialogues, it doesn't actually tell us what it is. In fact, it does something really curious, actually. So there's these sections where it talks about the stuff that Michael read about like what constitutes adequate knowledge of any object that has a name and definition. Can we just know it as a name, or do we also need to know its definition in order to adequate knowledge of it? And of course, they're like, oh yeah, you have to know a definition too. You can't just know the name of the good or virtue. You have to know the definition. But then it says like very curious things. I don't know if other people thought this too. So he says here, if this point eludes us, like what virtue is, can we ever expect to attain virtue when we can't say whether it compromises a great number of things or just four, or whether it is a unity? Also, here, the Athenian says, but what if they understood the point, but couldn't find the words to demonstrate it? And Inclinius was like, how absurd. That's the condition of a slave. And then Athena also says, if our guardians are going to be genuine guardians of the laws, they must have genuine knowledge of the real nature. They must be articulate enough to explain the real difference between good actions and bad, and capable of sticking to distinction in practice, and so on and so forth. I don't know if this is, a bit like a red herring, or like you find in many of the aporetic dialogues, but it's like the suggestion that the guardians have to be able to define it and say what it is, and be able to, like as he says, articulate enough to explain it. The words are articulate, as usually several times here, articulate what it is to others, presumably, and explain it. Are people like a bit puzzled by this? Because it seems like, for instance, in the analogy of divided line in the Republic, the good itself, it doesn't seem like we can say it or articulate it in this way. And of course, it's, as I already said, it should be, I think, a bit curious, at least, that although he keeps talking about this thing that the guardians have to understand, that he doesn't actually give us a definition here of what it is. He doesn't actually tell us what it is. So I'm not saying I have a pinned down view about what's going on here. I just think there's something a little bit curious going on here regarding, this talk about the adequate knowledge of what I presume is the good. Although, that is not even really made that explicit here. It's just saying that they have to know this thing about what it's aiming for, and that's left open. But then it also says stuff about how we have to be able to define it and articulate it, which is also goes against the grain of this very dialogue about it itself not articulating it, and also other places in other dialogues, what Plato says about the good itself, and what it is. Okay, I'm just bringing up what I think is something curious.
I appreciate it. James, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, actually, that was interesting that you raised that, Darren, and pointed out the way that courage can be problematic. And interesting that you highlighted that statement by the Athenian that the guardians have to have a genuine knowledge of real nature and must be articulate enough to explain the real difference between good actions and bad. There, I don't think he's saying that the guardians have to be able to define virtue, but be articulate to explain the real difference between good and bad. And I think that's the key there. I think he's implying that nobody can really define virtue because is virtue something that's teachable? If somebody were going to teach the guardians virtue, who would that be? So I think it's maybe just being able to discern between good and bad. And then that really raises one of the key themes of this whole dialogue, which is the theme of persuasion, the fact that souls persuade each other. And, we saw persuasion is prominent in the whole idea of the preambles for the laws, that there should be preambles that tell people why a law is necessary to persuade them to adhere to the law. And I think this is maybe one of those cases where the guardians should be, the best perhaps at persuasion in the community. So that's maybe my take on that. But certainly it's important for virtue to be articulated, I guess, in the sense of this difference between good and bad, because this colony is supposed to be based on virtue. The Constitution is supposed to be based on virtue, not just virtue among the leaders, but virtue among the citizens, because each citizen, it's their responsibility to be able to lead and to be led. And I think that's key. In fact, I was looking at the Jeremy Reed paper, The Offices of Magnesia, which sets out a summary of all of the officers in Magnesia. And I was counting them up, and I came to a count of about 600 or more. It's a little, some of the numbers are a little bit vague, but certainly the largest number of officers are the counselors, of which there's 360. But I counted over, around 600 officers. So here we have a community of 5,040 households where a substantial portion of them, more than 10%, are going to have some active role in the state. And so I think, as Michael said, it's necessary to have, or not maybe necessary, but certainly beneficial to have this nocturnal council that is not dealing with the day-to-day stuff that the officers are. All of these various households will have some contact with some of these officers, if not being officers themselves, and they'll be involved in the daily back and forth and might lose track of the causes and effects of the things that they're dealing with. And so to keep with this idea of looking for the unity, looking for the root cause, sitting up in that tree and looking at what the tree is rooted in that metaphor, I think it's necessary to have that time for reflection. And so it's very interesting that this council is to meet when all of that daily business is not going on, and to have that time for reflection, to look for those first principles and not be distracted by the daily give and take, I think. So that was one of my thoughts on that. And I guess I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful, James. Just real quick, in case people gathered here today or future podcast listeners who are looking at the handout are wondering why this passage we've been looking at about being genuine guardians, having genuine knowledge of the real nature, why I have underlined it, put it in bold, and colored it red. And that's because I wanted this particular excerpt to stand out above the others. I didn't want to populate too many footnotes, but if I were to add more footnotes than the one that's already there, I would have drawn your attention to the connection between this passage and the famous passage in the Phaedrus that talks about the joints in nature. This is another one of those passages where Plato has sort of embedded code words, if you will, the notion of the real difference, to point us to larger discussions in other dialogues. So that's not necessarily a direct reply to some of Darren's questions, but it is something, again, I want us to think about, that if there are places in this where it seems like the discussion is compact or questions are being raised that are not answered, I very much think it's because this dialogue presupposes all the others, and it's putting in these signals to point us back to other places where we would look for a fuller discussion. So here, I think this passage is pointing back to the Phaedrus. And I also think it's pointing back to the discussion about real classes in the Statesman, which is another place where Plato has his characters talking about how there's a true transcendental measure that the good of a society is determined by. Okay, Fred, I'm going to have Fred jump in here, and then I'm going to go ahead and just read our last little section. It's only 2 pages, and then we will have actually read all the passages on our handout, and then we can finish our discussion from there. So if you have more comments, please be ready to give them, but I'm going to have Fred go and then read our last passage. Go ahead, Fred.
I'm a little confused about the qualifications for the guardians and for the Nocturnal Council. And for the last session, we discussed this body that effectively serves as an auditor role of the guardians. I forget the name of it. What was that?
Scrutineers.
Scrutineers, yeah, scrutineers is a
But
great name.
but
Great
some
name.
some translations do call them auditors. Another translation I've seen is reviewers. I like scrutineers because it has that same root word scrutiny, which is very important in this text. Go ahead.
Right, I'll go with scrutineers. So we have guardians and scrutineers and this Nocturnal Council. And it appears that in terms of the qualifications, persuasive ability is described as one of the main qualifications. But I would take it here from the passage that we read and from other dialogues like Gorgias, I would take it that it's persuasion by means of reason. So, I mean, that seems like a constant theme of the other Platonic dialogues, and it seems to come through somewhat in this dialogue as well. It's not appeal to emotions or anything else as much as it is using reason to discuss the merits of practices. But I'm not clear about the distinction of the roles here of those three, and I'll call them bodies. I'm not sure they're really administrative bodies. The Nocturnal Council is not supposed to be an administrative body, but then at the very end it says, well, this is such a great idea, it should be effectively an administrative body. Yeah. And how we convince people that they should do this. And it seemed to somewhat optimistically say that, well, they'll just be so overwhelmed by the wisdom of this Nocturnal Council that they'll just immediately grasp it, and institute it. I'm not sure that bodes well for a continuation of it, but it's especially the difference between the scrutineers and the Nocturnal Council. I take it the scrutineers are really an auditing body to look for corruption among the auditors, and the Nocturnal Council has a more rarefied role. It's a sort of an auditing function in a way, but it's looking at whether the rules that are developed or laws that are developed by the guardians are sufficiently reasonable and rational. I don't get a sense of how they are appointed, or except that they'll just be so blindingly obvious that they're worthy to become a member of the Nocturnal Council that they'll just automatically be accepted. Is there more on that? Perhaps I missed something there.
Yeah, let me go ahead and jump in here, friend. Those are wonderful questions and observations. Let me say to your first point that yes, there's definitely a bit of optimism that the passage ends with. And for those of us who have been through the more cynical battles of politics, we might not feel as hopeful. But I will say, this is what I love about Plato. Like he has his characters just say like, yeah, we can do this and it'll be great. And I don't know, I find myself missing that kind of joy in my own world. But I want to point people to a couple key footnotes. I don't know if I can do this smoothly off the top of my head. So let me just scan through real quick. So there are two earlier passages in the laws, Fred, where the questions you're asking are laid out. So here on footnote 21, for people looking at the handout, I've noted the passage where the preliminary study of the guardians that are going to be on this Nocturnal Council is emphasized. And as you would expect from Plato, it's arithmetic, geometry, and cosmology. So they have to They have to be doing some science and some mathematics as the lead up to their study of virtue. And that passage, the footnote spills over, that passage is Laws 818A through C. So that gives some of the detail of what their education qualifications are. Again, for people, that's footnote 21. And then there's another section. Let's see if I can find it. I think it's towards the beginning here. I have a footnote on the process of selection for the members of the Nocturnal Council. Yeah, here it is. So footnote number 4, which is laws 951E through 952A, talks about the detailed membership of the Nocturnal Council, who these people are, and how they're going to be selected. So yeah, that came earlier than the explicit reading that we were given today. Okay, with that, let me go ahead and read our last passage, and then I will open it back up for discussion. So go ahead, raise hands. This last passage, which is on the soul, is also still on the Nocturnal Council. It actually comes in that little section we skipped. So any further comments we have on the Nocturnal Council will still be very appropriate. I titled this section, the second theme, The Primacy of the Soul. And James, there's a couple Clinius things in here, so I'll go ahead and have you play Clinius one more time. So this is 966E to 968B. The Athenian says, one is the point we've made about the soul, when we argue that it is far older and far more divine than all those things whose movements have sprung up and provided the impulse which has plunged it into a perpetual stream of existence. Another argument was based on the systematic motion of the heavenly bodies and the other objects under the control of reason, which is responsible for the order in the universe. No one who has contemplated all this with a careful and expert eye has in fact ever degenerated into such ungodliness as to reach the position that most people would expect him to reach. They suppose that if a man goes in for such things as astronomy and the essential associated disciplines, and sees events apparently happening by necessity, rather than because they are directed by the intention of a benevolent will, he'll turn into an atheist.
Well, what would happen, in fact?
Today, as I said, the situation is quite different from the time when thinkers regarded those bodies as inanimate. Even then, men were overcome with wonder at them, and those who studied them really closely got an inkling of the accepted doctrines of today, that such remarkably accurate predictions about their behavior would never have been possible if they were inanimate, and therefore irrational. And even in those days, there were some who had the hardihood to stick their neck out and assert it was reason that imposed regularity and order on the heavens. However, these same thinkers went sadly astray over the soul's natural priority to matter. Regarding soul as a recent creation, they turned the universe upside down, so to speak, and their own theories to boot. They concluded from the evidence of their eyes that all the bodies that move across the heavens were mere collections of stone and earth and many other kinds of inanimate matter. Inanimate matter which nevertheless initiated a chain of causation responsible for all the order of the universe. These views brought down on the philosophers' heads a great many accusations of atheism and provoked a lot of hostility. Poets, in particular, joined in the chorus of abuse, and among other inanities compared the philosophers to bitches baying at the moon. But today, as I said, the situation is fundamentally different.
Well, how so?
No mortal can ever attain a truly religious outlook without risk of relapse, unless he grasps the two doctrines we're now discussing. First, that the soul is far older than any created thing, and that it is immortal and controls the entire world of matter. And second, a doctrine we've expounded often enough before, that reason is the supreme power among the heavenly bodies. He also has to master the essential preliminary studies, survey with the eye of a philosopher what they have in common, and use them to frame consistent rules of action. And finally, when a reason explanation is possible, he must be able to provide it. No one who is unable to acquire these insights and rise above the level of the ordinary virtues will ever be good enough to govern an entire state, but only to assist government carried on by others. And that means, Clenius and McGillis, that we now have to consider whether we are going to add yet another law to the code we've already expounded, to the effect that the nocturnal council of the authorities, duly primed by the course of studies we've described, shall be constituted the legal protector of the safety of the state. Or is there some alternative course for us to take?
Oh, but my dear sir, there is no question of refusing to add this law, if we can manage it, even if our success is only partial.
Then let's make every effort to win the struggle. I've had a lot of experience of such projects and have studied the field for a long time, so I'll be more than happy to help you, and perhaps I shall find others to join me. So that concludes our reading, and I'll now open it up again for discussion. And I just want to say, I think this section, which was in that larger passage on the Nocturnal Council, speaks a little bit, Fred, to the questions you were raising again about, what kinds of things are these people going to have to study and what kind of qualifications are they going to have before they are, to quote the passage here, ever good enough to govern an entire state. So I hope people jump in and develop some of those thoughts. All right, Darren, go ahead.
Okay, so I actually put my hand up before we went to these new passages. So a couple of things. I wanted to respond to what you had said immediately prior about how the Nocturnal Council is made up, because I found it interesting that this head of the state, or heads actually of the state, isn't just made up of, the old men with their, wisdom and intellect. It also has these junior guardians, who have shown signs of virtue, but they're described as acting as reporters for their elder colleagues of everything that takes place in the state. And they're described as having, they store up in their memory all the sensations they have, and they're like the eyes, basically. So I find it interesting that there's this aspect of the Nocturnal Council that it has this sort of faculty for gathering information, presumably, accurate information and sensitive information about what's going on. So I find that there's this aspect interesting. And then also regarding described as the old men here, they're said to take advantage of the assistance and advice of their juniors in debating policy so that the joint efforts of both ranks effectively ensure the safety of the entire state. And I think another part of the Nocturnal Council was also the travelers who come back, who have seen other places and come back with their insights about politics and society from other places. So the thing I find interesting is that, again, it's not like one person, it's not like one wise person who decides everything. It's like a group of old men who are set to debate policy. So it's not even like that they can necessarily just intuit what necessarily the good thing to do is from all this information they're gathering. Like they have to discuss it and debate it. So I guess this also comes back again to, like, I guess maybe some of the previous comments I made about their need to be articulate and be able to demonstrate it and express it. And actually, so this was about the other point I wanted to make. I wanted to respond to James's response to my response regarding this thing about being able to articulate what virtue is and explain it and the various ways he puts that, or say what it is. Because there is a section here which is interesting, because as we encounter across many of Plato's dialogues, a common concern to many of them is the possibility of sophistry, or how philosophy is different from sophistry. Like, it's always the shadow of philosophy. There's always this possibility that maybe philosophy is just all sophistry, because it's not just philosophers who are, happy to talk about the good and discourse about the good and try to convince you what the good or bad is, as we know from Protagoras and many, many other dialogues, that there are these other people who also claim to be able to tell you what the good is, as Protagoras does in that famous dialogue on that sophist, but also many other dialogues too. So there's some competition here, right? So he talks about, the poet visitors to the state, and the self-styled educationalists going to put up a better show than the winner of the palm for every kind of virtue, like discussing it and explaining, I guess. So I'm like,
Which, Darren, I want to say you are absolutely correct. These are code words for sophists.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's what I assume. Because, and it's also that, sophistry is always in the background, like lurking in the background as a shadow of these dialogues. Maybe it's all just sophistry. Because the sophists, as we see in Protagoras and Hippias and many other dialogues, that they can be very persuasive and convincing. That's what that's what makes them sophists, right? And they do use reason. Like Protagoras puts up a pretty good fight for Socrates and arguing and using reason. So again, this is not a critique. I just think there's something curious going on here about how it's flagging this thing that what was again the statesman reason aims at. I think ultimately it's the good. There's like so many other dialogues, but like the way it talks about it being able to articulate it. So I also posted some of the quotes again in the comments because I think it does put this point quite strongly. So it says here, what constitutes adequate knowledge of any object that has a name and a definition is enough to know only the name and not the definition. And then he comes down like, oh yeah, we have to know the definition. And then he also says here, I think this part's also interesting, a bit of dialogue. So Athenian says, well, then, do we take the same line about goodness and beauty? Should the guardians know no more than that both terms are a plurality, or should they understand the senses in which they are unities? And Clinias says, it looks as if they are more or less obliged to comprehend that too, how they are unities. And Athenian says, but what if they understood the point, but couldn't find the words to demonstrate it? And Clinias says, how absurd. That's a condition of a slave. So I wonder if Plato's like being playful or tricky here because although Clinias says how absurd, that's a condition of a slave. So it sounds like, okay, yeah, we do have, as so much of this ending is suggesting that we need to articulate it and so on, be able to explain like it itself, not just its consequences or whatever, because the fight is with the sophists. They're going to try to do that too. But the philosopher presumably knows this further thing. And like here, it's saying it can articulate it and say it. But when Clinias says how absurd, that's a condition of a slave, I actually wonder if that's like something tricky that we find in the end of so many Plato's dialogues. So maybe it's not so bad to be a slave of the good, at least. So anyway, maybe I'm reading too much into it. I just feel like there's something like curious going on here about like the status of the good and how it's saying it can be articulated. But of course, this dialogue doesn't actually say it, nor does any other dialogue actually say it, even though it's saying we have to be able to say it.
Well, I definitely think that the goal of all these dialogues is to say, in a sense, we're always going to be a slave of something. And so the thing to be a slave of is the good. That is a good thing. And that's the goal here in many ways, is to make sure that everybody is a slave of the good rather than, say, a slave of Thrasymachus, which nobody wants except Thrasymachus.
Or Hippias, he's the
Or
worst.
Hippias, sure, absolutely. I just want to highlight one thing from what you said that I think will also tie into some of Fred's questions, and it relates to this passage you drew our attention here to, where we get this allusion to the sophist. So in the sentence right before it, this is a description of the philosophers in the Nocturnal Council. It says, should they not prove better than anyone else in giving the criminal a full explanation and description of the effects of virtue and vice? Now, this may not have registered to people as this is actually referring to a concrete policy proposal that happened earlier in the dialogue. And for your convenience, I footnoted it. So at footnote 19, I give the law here that's being described, which says, those who have simply fallen victim to foolishness and who do not have a bad character and disposition should be sent to the Reform Center by the judge in accordance with the law for a term of not less than 5 years. And during this period, no citizen may come into contact with them except the members of the Nocturnal Council, who should pay visits to admonish them and ensure their spiritual salvation. I think this is really interesting because there's this primary role of the Nocturnal Council, which is to ensure that the work of philosophy continues to guide the guardians of the laws, the scrutineers, the work of the ambassadors, and so forth. But then there's this secondary role, which is very concrete, that they're supposed to have a rehabilitation prison next to their place of meeting, where they go and meet with the prisoners and help them become people who can reintegrate into society under the auspices of virtue. And I just think that's such an interesting contrast to put in this place against the next sentence where it's opposed to the sophist. That I don't know if the implication is supposed to be that a sophist would never try to reform the people in prison or something like that. I don't know, but I just wanted people to realize that there is this very concrete purpose for the members of the Nocturnal Council being able to articulate virtue in the way that they do. It's because they've got to go persuade people who lack virtue on how to become virtuous so that they can leave the Reform Center and reintegrate into society. James.
Actually, there was a really great connection that you made there, Michael, to what Darren was saying with respect to what it would be like to be a slave, because to be a slave, you don't act according to reason, you act according to prescription, I think. And this is maybe where this last reading that you did, it's a great recollection of what was in book 10, which is where we started the series, which tells us that reason itself is in the middle of the universe and that the soul is the oldest thing in the universe. And if there's one thing that you can't be a slave to, it's reason, because you're acting according to reason. So if you're a slave, you're like the patient of the doctor who just simply issues a prescription that we heard about in an earlier book, and not the doctor that educates. But, I think what you were just saying, Michael, about the Nocturnal Council persuading and educating, and to do that, you need to understand, or at least be able to find your way to the first principles of the thing that you're trying to describe. And that first principle of everything in that last reading that you did is reason, which is in the very center of the universe. I just wanted to recall a couple of passages from book 10. There was at 892C, it was said that the soul is preeminently natural, which is to say that the soul is not something separate from nature. It's woven into the fabric of nature. It's part of the fabric of nature. And then there was the sections from 893C to 896E that we read in book 10 that talks about this unique property of the soul being capable of self-generating motion, and therefore the soul is the original cause of all subsequent events in the universe. And I think this last reading that you did really just ties all of that together wonderfully. And it makes me go back to a question that I had earlier, and I don't think we ever got an answer to. But if reason was not intrinsic to the universe, if it did not precede the physical universe, but came after the physical universe, then it would be subject to the physical universe. And so my question earlier was some episodes back, what difference would it make if we all woke up tomorrow thinking that the soul is the first cause of everything in the universe? It just makes me wonder, with that last reading that you did, would that fundamentally persuade people to act differently, or at least to see things in a fundamentally different perspective? Because I think a lot of people now, I would say a substantial majority would say that the physical universe came first, and then somehow through some chemical or other processes, reason and the soul emerged afterwards. And so those would be subject to the physical universe. But I think here he's saying that it's absolutely the other way around. I think he used the phrase that perception is upside down. That was one of the fundamental questions I had about this dialogue is, what difference would it make if we all of a sudden just understood or accepted that the soul is older than the physical universe, that it is the basis, it is the first cause? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, wonderful. I think I'm going to make one closing comment here in response to your excellent question there, James, and then I'll hand it over to you to continue the discussion for a more open contemplation on the laws, because I think you've already raised a very large scale question. And Darren, you can just jump in and keep the conversation going from there. And I just want to make one last observation about the text here, since James raised this, which is I have a footnote here. I think it's one of my last footnotes where footnote 30, where he talks about the expectation in the popular imagination that philosophers who study the heavens all turn into atheists. And I note there that, as we've talked about before in book 10, that's really not the best translation It may be a literal translation, but it's really not the best one because as we see in the next section, what's actually being talked about here is a view that's materialist. The concern here is that somebody who sees the heavens moving by necessity is going to become a materialist and think the only things up there are, as he puts it, mere collections of stone and earth and other kinds of inanimate matter. And inanimate is old Greek speak for something that doesn't have a soul animating it. The soul is always the origin of motion for Plato and Aristotle, who will follow him on this. So I just wanted to highlight that really what's being articulated here is, and back to Fred's question of why the guardians and the members of the Nocturnal Council need to be excellent in theology, it's because the view of the universe as governed by the rationality of soul is a theological position as opposed to the materialist position, which says the nature of things is governed by an impersonal necessity that just drives things, it's billiard balls bouncing off of each other and there's no reason to it whatsoever. Those are the two views that I think are being opposed here in the final reading. And Plato obviously has his characters come down on the side of soul because he wants to say that it really is reason that's structuring the nature of things, not blind necessity. So with that, James, I'm going to hand the hosting duties over to you to round us out. And I'm sure you already noticed that Darren wants to jump back in here.
Well, that's great. Yes, and thanks. And Darren, we'll get to you in just a minute. I just wanted to, so thank you, Michael, for helping with this episode, as well as many others in this series. It's been great to share the responsibilities with you on this. And you've added a lot of very interesting and helpful context, I think, to these discussions, including what you just said about, a universe that's constructed only on necessity versus one that is constructed on reason. And I think that's pretty fundamental to this dialogue here. I just wanted to, before opening up to some general reflections on the laws, just to say that I went through the notes for all of our sessions and picked out just some of what I think are the main topics or themes. We had early in the laws the theme of pain and pleasure and self-control. I think that was a big one. And then the idea of wealth distribution, making sure that the distribution didn't get so out of control that it caused unneeded friction. And then there's that whole theme of harmony and proportion, I think, in this. And also then that leads to memory and measurement. And again, there's this persistent idea in this dialogue, as well as through Plato's other dialogues, that man is not the measure of all things. In fact, at one point he says, this is at 716d, in our view, it is God who is preeminently the measure of all things. And, if you don't like the word God, maybe read that as universe. So that's another major theme. Education and persuasion is a major theme, I think. And that, as I said earlier, ties into the idea that laws should always have a preamble that explains the reason. And reason, obviously, is something that we've just talked about. And the common good, I think, is something that's very key to this dialogue, is leaders don't just do things that are good for a particular group of people at a particular time. They are doing something that is good for all people for all time. And that is far more profitable, I think, in the end analysis, and leads to that harmony and proportion. So I want to just raise those general thoughts. I think we've actually had in this discussion interesting recollection of a number of different things that have been said throughout the laws. And I think it's very helpful to bring things together. So I would just open to any sort of general reflections on the laws, but we'll take, Darren, your point, and if you have any general reflections, add them as well.
Okay, I've accumulated a few points. I'm listening to both Michael and James. I want to go back to the challenge James gave us to think about, what difference would it make to see the soul as the center of the universe? So that is from book 10. And one thing I gleaned from that, which I thought was a cool insight when I was reading book 10, is that understanding that soul, which I think for him is like related to reason and like governs the motions of the universe, is at the center of the universe. I thought actually in Book 10 was argued to make political philosophy itself possible because it was arguing against this alternate view. It was presenting this alternate view that politics and governments, it was saying it was just artificial. So that laws, they're just like fictions. It's ultimately, all about the rule of the powerful who gets to make the laws. There's like no real standard of justice because it's something that comes afterwards rather than something that comes at the origin. And I think when you reverse that, I think at least book 10 seems to suggest it makes something like political philosophy possible because it's not just about power. When we try to figure out or understand what justice is, it's not just whatever the powerful does. He said there, it was just convention. It was just convention about like one person saying that this is just and everyone just has to go along because they just happen to be more powerful at that point. It could just be that, right? You could just see it purely as this realist view that it's like all just power games, including our discourse about justice. It's just artificial. It's all about, just individuals trying to benefit themselves or their own group or whatever. So anyway, I thought that was a very clear reversal itself in book 10. So I think it might be tied with the kind of reversal that you're talking about. So obviously it's not the only thing that it would help to see the soul as a center universe, but I think that's one idea. I also really liked what you pointed out earlier about the fake versus the real doctors. That great analogy that comes up several times in the laws. So you were saying how like the real doctor would actually explain to the patient why that's good for them or whatever, whereas a fake doctor doesn't actually know. So they're just like do this, do that, and they just order people around and just they act like they know, but they just make declarative statements about what you need to do. But another thing I thought that struck me about that analogy was that Plato or the Athenian describes real doctors as also listening. And they also gain your consent. They listen and they gain your consent. Like they're not gonna use force or just impose themselves, I guess. And so this also, I mean, this actually relates to the discussion about Nocturnal Council because they have those people who go out, the reporters they were called, who like, try to find out like what's going on out there. So they're listening, right? So that analogy between the real and fake doctors, which I thought was just great on its own, actually also really makes sense. It was a reflection of Nocturnal Council too. So there's another like way in which this ending sort of encapsulates a lot of themes, as Michael was saying, from the rest of the laws. So I thought that was an interesting connection. I also want to respond to Michael about theology and the religious point of view, but I've gone a long time, so maybe I'll just let someone else go first, and then I'll come back to talking about that. Yeah, if anyone else wants to have something to say.
Well, thanks, Darren. And I really like your point, actually. I hadn't thought about that the soul being the first cause or reason being at the center of the universe leads to political philosophy and a standard. I think that's the key. The idea of the root. Everything is rooted to one thing. There's that common root.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it because otherwise it just does become a very power-centered thing, and people view needs and power differently at different times in response to different needs. But if we're always able to step back and look at the reason, then the philosophy emerges from it and the common things, the standards over time. I think that's really good. Yeah, really helpful. And I think that's a really good answer to the question. The question remains, what difference would it make if we all thought that the soul is the first cause of everything? I guess another question I have, well, I have two other questions. Is magnesia going to be successful? This is something I spoke on in our Book 11 episode, where I saw the Athenian contradicting some of the things he had said earlier. And I thought this was maybe a test of Clinias, who's going to lead the new colony. And so I wonder whether we think magnesia is going to be successful after all of this. And I'm trying to put myself in the place of, if I were if I were among the first guardians, what would be the first law that I would write? The very first law that I would write. I'm developing an idea about that, but I put that question on the floor because I guess, if we each had that responsibility, we'd have to come to some conclusion as what would be the most important law. So I'll put those on the floor. Michael and then Darren.
James, I wanted to respond to the first of your two questions there. The one of whether or not magnesia will be successful. I think your question relates in a nice way to some of the questions that Ella was asking in our last recording about whether or not everybody has been appropriately included in the common good. And I've given this a lot of thought over the last couple of weeks, and the conclusion I came to is on my reading of the Republic and of the Laws, books 1 through 10, I do see systems being put forward where everybody is given a full share in the common good, and everyone has been given full status as a citizen apart from slaves. Slaves have a sort of unique place in here because slaves are almost predominantly envisioned to be foreigners. So they're people who have come into the society through the larger geopolitical relationships between warring states. But what's interesting is even though slaves are not given the full share of citizenship, they're still included in the common good. And there's still this clear expectation that the relationship they have to the society has to be good for them as well as for the community. So there, you can't abuse your slaves. You can't, use them in some kind of abusive fashion. So that, the one thing that they don't get rid of is the slave trade. And my view of that is because only empires can abolish slavery because it's an international problem, not a national problem. But other than that, I see everybody being given full inclusion. In the Republic, men and women have full status in every part of the society. And in books 1 through 10 of the laws, I see the same thing. It's very clear that women will have full participation in the selection procedures, full participation in all of the offices, including the Nocturnal Council. But then we get to book 11, and there's that passage you noted where the Athenian sort of holds over this old patriarchal model of who heads the household, who is the Kyrios, the lord of the household. And, one reading is certainly the one you gave, James, where we say this is a test for Clinius to figure out whether or not this is consistent with the earlier principles. I don't think it is. It also could be, though, that the Athenian puts that forward because they couldn't imagine what we know today, which is you can have a shared household leadership where the two spouses hold the Kyrios together rather than one or the other. So it might just be a failure of imagination. In any way, to get to your question now, I don't think that proposal of the Athenian about the household lordship would survive. And here's my reason for saying that. Either one, if you had a society outlined the way we've seen in the laws and you had that household lordship code in place, eventually women would end up being excluded from all public offices, I think. If they're excluded from lordship in the households, they're eventually going to be excluded from participation in public life. And that would mean you've contradicted the fundamental principles of the society. And the Nocturnal Council in that case should say, whoa, we blew it here. We got something wrong. This needs to go. The other way I think it would come out is if women are given the full place in the public society, as we see in books 1 through 10, then the women who are in leadership, I think, are going to rightly overrule this archaic household code and say, nope, that's not in conformity with reason. And I would hope that they would adopt a more shared Kyrios model where the spouses head the household together. So that's my comment on that, and I hope it spoke to some of the questions that were raised in our last episode.
Well, that's great, Michael. Thank you. And yeah, I really like the way that you said that everyone has a full share in the common good. Even if, as you say, even if the thing about the contradiction about women, the reason given first in an earlier passage saying that they should be treated equally in a state that doesn't treat women equally is only half a state. And then the Athenian goes and kind of seems to contradict that. It's interesting that that contradiction was not provided with a reason. So as you say, it leaves a path in the future for a nocturnal council or the guardians to change a law predicated on reason. I think that would be a useful thing. So, and I would say too, is it going to be successful? Well, even if Clinius isn't necessarily the standout in all of the conversation in this dialogue. I think certainly the way they've constructed the colony by giving roles to so many people in the colony and giving everybody a responsibility, leader and citizens, everyone has a responsibility to become virtuous. I think the distribution of roles and responsibilities is something that really, I can't think of anything better that would stand a colony for a good chance in the future. So I think that's something to think about too. And whether Clinius fails or succeeds, I mean, there'll be other guardians as well. So he's just one. So yeah, thank you very much. That's great.
James, I'd recommend letting Ella jump in here just because I was hoping she would have some thoughts on my response.
Well, absolutely. Sure. We'll take Ella and then Darren.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes. Well, I had a couple of follow-up questions, Michael, in regards to your statement, and thank you for looking over those points that I had made last time. So, yeah, and you brought up the Republic, and I know that's not the text we're discussing right now, but, and I'm not clear about this myself, but I do remember, I have a couple of points. There seems to be the tripartite soul seems to be associated, as you know, with that ancient alchemy class where the guardians are silver, the philosopher kings are gold, and the lower half of the pyramid, they would be base metal. And these are all souls, human beings, souls that are, leveled, as it were. And so, two questions on that would be on that tripartite soul. Is that dealt away with? I hope so, in the laws, because I missed a couple sessions. I'm not sure. Did they get rid of that? Or deal with it, speak to it, update it in any way? And that was also associated with classes. Now, when it comes to classes, the craftsman class, which would be equivalent to the working class today. Okay, so the craftsman class, the women, of course, were not equal. And there was a group of people I'm still unclear about called the free non-citizens. They're free, but they're not citizens. And then you had the slaves, as you covered that well. And I was wondering, if you had all these people up, that's going to be the majority of the population, either in Magnesia or in the Republic. And I was thinking, that's a lot of people that are not citizens, or now some of them can own land. Like I think the craftsmen can own land, but they don't have the right to an education. So there's still that, it seems to be that theory in the Republic where you are what you are, you're born as you're born in your particular metal, whatever that might be, like a caste system. And no, you're better at farming and, cutting grain. And so no education for this group. This group can own property, but no education. So there's a lack of flow up and down the system for people, especially in the Republic. I think they called it the Great Lie or the Big Lie. Let's tell them the Guardians are silver, that they're special and all that, and that all the souls are constructed this way. And I wanted to ask also, it's a lot, the forms. Who actually gets contact or proximity with the forms? Is that everyone, or is that only for those who are educated, which seems to be limited only to a certain amount of people? Because the forms are the access not only to rule or to have higher responsibilities to rule as philosopher king, but to freedom. They're the path to freedom, to actualize oneself. So I know it's a lot. So just pick a couple of, yeah.
Well, if James, if you don't mind, let me say a couple things real quick, and then I'll get out of Darren's way here, because I think you have asked something valuable, which is what is the relationship between this work, the laws, and the Republic? And I think your questions sort of raise, the nature of this dialect. And I do think there's some confusion because they are not the same work. So the Callipolis, which is being described in the Republic, is one self-sustained society, whereas Magnesia, which is the society in the laws, which is a sort of second best attempt to imagine an actual creation in the near future, is a different society. We don't want to just kind of blend together uncritically theses that are said in one and theses that are said in another. So let me just real quick, I think I can do this in a couple minutes. So when it comes to who gets included in the forms, in the laws, it's very clear that all people are going to be educated universally in virtue. So in some sense, everybody's going to get some contact with the forms. But the expectation is not everybody is going to have the kinds of gifts or time or virtues to be able to fully contemplate the forms. And so we need to have a special guild of people whose job it is to contemplate those forms and make sure that everybody participates in the benefits of that wisdom. So there's a little bit of an ambiguity to this question of who gets to participate in the forms. Plato's view is everyone, but not because necessarily everybody is doing the contemplation, but because those who are unable to do the full level of contemplation still have leaders who make sure they benefit from that level of contemplation. And the other major question you have is the relationship between this myth of metals in the Republic to the system that we see in the laws. And I do want to push back slightly on your characterization of the myth of metals, Ella, because I actually think you've read it sort of inverted to the intention that Socrates gives it in the dialogue. The myth of metals is this noble lie is actually there for the purpose of saying the people who serve in each role do so because that's where their gifts lie. But people who have those gifts can actually come from any part of the society. So it's not a rigid caste system where there's no mobility. Quite the opposite. The purpose of it is to say, hey, you could have two, say, working class parents, and they give birth to a gold child who becomes a philosopher. Or vice versa. The philosophers could give birth to people who are better suited to being in the working class. So the real purpose of the myth of metals was actually to say you can't come up with a caste system that says people will be suited for these roles by hereditary, by the class they were born into, but rather that they are suited for these roles by their disposition to having the competencies and virtues that help them to excel in that kind of a work. So that's actually the openness of the myth of metals. And I do see the same kind of openness being shown in the laws, where guardians, scrutineers, the minister of education, these people can come from any part of the society. There's no sort of sectioning off by race or ethnicity or background or anything like that of who can't be other than maybe foreigners, because there's a lot of concern about corruption coming from foreigners. So I hope that wasn't too compressed, but that's kind of my big picture look of how I actually do see a lot of equality and inclusion in the model that they've set up. James, I'll hand it over to you now.
Well, it's great and really good questions, Ella. It really help us to focus, I think, on this dialogue and to compare it to others. And Michael, your explanations I thought were really on point. The other thing I would add to what you said, Ella, is that there's a very different process here. Even though the term guardian is used in the laws and in the Republic, it's a different sort of guardian. And in the laws, it's the guardian is selected by everybody. There's a very elaborate selection process where everybody has a say, not only in nominating, but also in rejecting nominations. So I think it's a very important safeguard in the system The other thing I would mention too is that the council, which includes 360 people, includes people from each of the classes. So there's 4 classes. And the way the wealth is distributed is that there will not be one overwhelming class. There's this attempt to make sure that there's a balance between the classes. And I think the council is one method of that. So I thought that was very helpful and very good to contrast what was said in the Republic to what's being said in the laws. So I will go to Darren and just note that we are at time with our episode, but if we can go maybe for another 10 minutes or so and reach some conclusion. So I'll go to Darren.
Thanks, James. So since we are at the end here, I do have my own thoughts about the dialogue in general, like my own kind of overview of what I've gotten from it, at least. But I raised my hand because it was a long time ago. I wanted to respond to something about actually, like I think Fred just left, yeah, about the stuff about the theological teaching or the role of theology. And Michael also mentioned this, but also I just want to bring my own thoughts about this and its place in the dialogue. And then I think I can actually tie this in with some of my general thoughts on the dialogue as a whole. So I'm going to attempt this. So first of all, regarding the theology thing, so he says at the end in the reading for this week about the truly religious outlook that we need, and he talks about certain beliefs related to that. And so this reminded me actually of book 5. I think we had at least at least I was discussing this in book 5, where I thought it was this really interesting distinction being made there between a secular point of view of ethics and a religious point of view. And so there's these two approaches to ethics, and starts to talk about religious one, and he sort of flags it, and then he says, "Oh, but we've only been talking about the religious point of view, and now here's a secular view for, I don't know, ordinary human beings or something like that." And so, in the laws, at least, when he's talking about the religious point of view, it's actually not about just about religion per se. It's about a higher, or maybe purer, I don't know what word you want to use, a higher ethical outlook. So in book 5, this was some of my favorite parts of the laws. He was describing the more religious point of view, where ethics is about doing good for the sake of the good. It's not about you. So he says things like, regarding acts of justice, he talks about how, it's not just things you do to admire in yourself as if they're your own possessions, but he says you should admire them not only when they are your own, but especially when they happen to be done by someone else. And you should make more of the services people do to you and esteem them more highly than they do, and put a smaller value on your own good turns to your friends and companions than they do themselves, and stuff like that. Anyway, ethics is about the good itself and not about what is good for you as an individual person per se, whether that's your happiness or pleasure, or whatever, however you flesh that out. So I talked about this in terms of there's objection to certain approaches to ethics where it's very self-absorbed. It's just ethics is actually about you in the end, about your own happiness or eudaimonia or something. And there's a critique of this approach to ethics. But in book 5, when it was describing the religious point of view, it wasn't about that. It was about the good itself. Of course, then it starts talking about the secular point of view of ethics. So I thought it was very confusing because there it talked about how doing good will ultimately lead to your own pleasure and your own happiness. So first of all, I think just in response to Fred, I think the theological point of view is tied to like a more higher ethical a way of life. But okay, so I'm going to segue into my general comment and I'm done. And it's related to what I've been talking about, because I guess one very general point that I took away from reading the laws is this kind of duality between the presence of a religious point of view in the state, which might be more embodied in Nocturnal Council, but also accommodating the secular point of view or a more secular kind of ethics where, like, I don't know, it maybe just by disposition or powers of reason or something, that some people, he actually even says this in book 5, that actually pleasure and pain is like the most powerful motivator for people, or most people. I forget exactly how it's put there, but he does say this. But I think it's quite clear that the guardians, that most ethical people, are acting ethically according to the religious description of it. But there's going to be a lot of people who maybe adhere more to the secular point of view. So it's interesting in book 5, it presents both views. It doesn't really like even try to reconcile them. It just presents both of them. And there's a presence of both. And that was very confusing to me, but it actually all makes sense now, because in the state, I think it is just saying that there are both kinds of people. And this duality is just present, I think, in this entire dialogue and just informs so many of the conclusions and discussions of the dialogues. I was just going to point out some examples just cursorily, and then I'm done. So, for instance, it's in all the discussion about how we're trying to achieve the second best constitution. We're not talking about the most ideal. So he talks about how we're developing a constitution for like actual human beings, and there's a comparison with how Kronos might have done it or what that might have been like. But we're not gods; we're human beings governing human beings. And there's this interesting section where he talks about the embarrassment of the laws because the fact that we need laws in the first place. So, I mean, this is another kind of concession, like the very need for laws and also like the way the laws are understood here. And that, in fact, there is a persuasive aspect, maybe that appeals to a reason. But if that doesn't work, there's also the punishment aspect. So the punishment is towards a pain and pleasure aspect. But it's not saying that we're only like that. It's, again, this duality that we also have the possibility of approaching a more religious attitude towards life and ethics. So that's where the persuasion comes in. And this duality, I think, is also present in the focus on institutions. The duality is also present in the focus on the conditions for success of the state. So it's not like, it talked about how you have to find the right people and the right location so they don't get corrupted by like trade. And it can't be too close to the coast because that could be corrupting and all this stuff. That's a concession to like maybe the more secular view of human beings. I think it also makes sense of some confusing things. So, for instance, some parts of the dialogue I thought was confusing. There's actually two views of religion here. Like at some points, it appeals to certain myths and gods and the punishment in the afterlife. And then, of course, but in Book 10, we saw the more pure theology that I think Plato himself adheres to. But then there's also all this other stuff about multiple different kinds of gods and various myths and stuff, which is very confusing. Like, what is the real religion here? But we don't have to choose. Again, it's a concession to the duality of human beings. Like some people, maybe the myths and the gods, I don't think Plato himself believes in, but like maybe they have a role in the world. And then there's a more pure kind. So, and okay, just the last couple of things. The discussion of law and custom, I think, also relate to this. And of course, just the very fact of mixed constitutions and how we're not supposed to have absolute rulers and how like the state has to be like a mix of different things. I think a lot of this does read down to just the duality between, as I was saying, that we see on Book 5, the presence of a religious point of view, which is the much more pure and a secular version. So, and okay, just like 20 seconds response to James's question about would magnesia be successful. I guess for me, I actually think of the question in terms of how like we should understand this for us, like given what we know and given our stage of development, because Magnesia is like it's like a relatively small city compared to Toronto. There's 3 million in here in our city and 10 million in the metro area. So what would it look like for us? And also the question of there was a discussion in I think Book 8 or whatever, I forget, but it was where they were talking about founding the state, and that was a section about purging, or not Book 8, maybe Book 7. It was about purging the state and all that. But then we had a debate about that. But then he also said there that, well, actually, we're talking about brand new state, so maybe it's possible to do that in the brand new state. But in an established state, you can only do reforms. So what does all this mean for us and how we might apply it and use it to aid the success of our own polities today? So sorry, that went a long time, but yeah, I'm trying to wrap everything up.
Yeah, thanks. And you certainly touched on many important points here, Darren. I think one of the key points that you touched on, even with what you ended up saying there in terms of how the magnesia sort of setup could translate into our much larger societies now, I think a lot of this dialogue is really about psychology, about just understanding human behavior. And so maybe there's a template here, and maybe some of the numbers that Plato puts in this, like the number 5040, maybe there's some basis there to expand, multiply, and apply the basic principles on a much larger scale. So it's a very interesting question. And as you said, they acknowledged that they could not reach the ideal constitution, so they're looking for the second best. And the mixed constitution aspect of it is definitely an interesting point to recall. So I think those are all very helpful points. To answer my own question, I guess, with respect to the first law that I would write if I were in charge of this colony, I'm just thinking about it out loud, I might call it the law of preservation of reason. The first law would maybe be that all subsequent laws should be predicated on reason, with a long preamble to say why reason should be the predicate for all subsequent laws. So maybe that's one thought to throw out there, but I think that's really the key takeaway for me from this dialogue. So, Ella, would you like to take us to a conclusion?
I hope so. I don't know if my question will take us there, but basically, yeah, I'm trying to tie together the ideal constitution in the laws and perhaps looking over our shoulder at the republic, but particularly the laws. In terms of taking a different take, the geometry, the forms, their relationships. Of course, I don't know about everybody's ability to obtain an education toward acquiring geometry skills. So that's sort of bothersome. But yeah, there's the relation. What is the relationship for Plato between the geometry and the forms? And then when one comes in contact with the forms, or in the presence of the forms or near the forms, this would, I would think, constitute a change in the individual in some way, but I'm struggling to try to get a grasp on that. And is that an individual journey? And then is that individual journey the way to the collective journey, in the sense that when you go, you learn, you gain that greater consciousness, as it were, in the soul, and then you come back and you're a good citizen, ruler, whatever the case may be, and attempt to live in and or contribute to society and help other people. So I'm particularly, interested in knowing the individual's role in the growth via the forms, in this case, versus the collective growth and the individual's responsibility, if any, toward the collective. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those questions and observations, Ella. Those were really great. I'll take us to a conclusion then, maybe with some thoughts on what you've just said. There was actually a passage in Book 10, around 904d, where the Athenian says, "So all things that contain soul change," and this is because the soul is self-moving, "the cause of their changing lying within themselves. And as they change, they move according to the ordinance and law of destiny." And so my view of the geometry is that geometry is the study of connections, cause and effect in time. And so everything comes to be from a cause, is part of Plato's essential understanding of the universe. And so if we can trace all of the connections from cause to effect over time, then that leads one individual not only to knowledge. Knowledge in the Meno is said to be recollection, and then it's further defined, recollection is further defined as the account of the reasons why. So an individual needs to be able to trace the connections of cause and effect to make an account of the reasons why, which is to have knowledge. But then one individual having knowledge is good, but it doesn't do the community good, and no individual can operate entirely on their own. And so there has to be a sharing of knowledge. And this is where, as I said earlier in this meeting, that there was that definition of virtue at 653b as a general concord of reason and emotion. So this is, we're all operating with some degree of emotion and some degree of knowledge. And when all of that's brought together with virtue, this concord, I think that's the important thing. And so to see a universe centered on reason, where this universe itself has a soul, everything is connected to reason, everything is connected to the soul. We are each branches of a soul. So if you think of a geometric branching, everything is connected. So I think the key to geometry and numbers in Plato is all about connections. And he has said in this dialogue, or the Athenian has said in this dialogue, that the soul is the very first cause of everything in the universe. So to trace the connection in our soul, individual soul, to the universal soul, also needs to understand the connections to the souls within the community, the souls of the 5,040 homes in the case of Magnesia. So hopefully that gives some sort of overview of what I think the consequences of geometry and the connections of individual to the community is. And then the forms really, I think, are the basic outlines, the basic structures, the first principles of things. For everything, there's a first principle, and the form is a first principle. And so, again, to find the first principle, we need to trace all of those connections from what we see and the reasons we make from what we see to find those first principles. We can't find the first principle just from seeing alone. We need to apply reason to find the first principles. And reason is in the scope of the soul only, and it's not a physical sense. So that's where the soul needs to operate with those connections, to understand those connections. I think that's the absolute key. So that would be my take on it. I think that was a really good question. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everybody for participating. It's been an absolutely great series. I mean, this is 14 episodes later. As always, we don't have any concrete conclusions, I guess, but we have a lot of really interesting ideas that are pointing towards something that is, I think, pretty fundamental. And it's a really interesting last dialogue for Plato. Really interesting last dialogue. Quite different, I think, from anything else that he wrote, but it is definitely a compendium, I think, of everything that he has written. So it's been a great study, and I really appreciate everybody being here and participating in all the great comments that we've had. I'll end the recording now. And as I said at the outset, this is also the end of season 4, but we will start season 5 within 6 to 8 weeks. So everybody stay tuned for that. And we'll have more discussions on Plato. And I would invite anybody who wants to stay online. We just have a short amount of time left, but if we could stay online briefly after this. And I want to wish everybody a great rest of the summer and look forward to seeing you in the fall. So thanks very much for attending. Bye-bye.